Okay, so our speaker today is Dr. David John Gagne. Dr. Gagne is a machine learning scientist and head of the Analytics and Integrated Machine Learning Group at NCAR. So he's an expert on developing explainable machine learning systems for a wide range of Earth system science challenges. These include predicting high impact weather and emulating computational demanding physical models. Dr. Gagne received his PhD in meteorology from the University of Oklahoma, and he completed an advanced study program postdoctoral fellowship at NCAR. So today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Gagne here to talk about machine learning emulation across the Earth system. So DJ, maybe you can take it from here.
Thank you, Anne. Let me go ahead and turn on the slideshow here. Okay. So good morning, everyone. As Anne mentioned, we'll be talking about machine learning emulation across the Earth system. I wanted to highlight a few of the kind of projects in this area that are going on with that my group is supporting, and kind of talking about some of the advantages and potentials of emulation, but also some of the challenges. So first, I wanted to highlight the group we have working on this. So there's myself on the left, then we have our other machine learning scientist, John Schreck. We have two associate scientists, Gabrielle Gantos and Charlie Becker. Then two undergraduate student assistants, Keely and Gunther, and then our PhD student intern, Dallas Foster, who's currently in the process of finishing up his PhD and looking for postdoc opportunities. So first, I want to make a kind of the case for why machine learning emulation. Why is this an important thing to do right now? A number of groups have been kind of working on this in different aspects, and it's all kind of come about pretty heavily in the past couple of years. Some of the work dates back to like the early 2000s, but why the recent uptick in interest? A lot of this is being driven by our kind of desire to keep making our Earth system models increasingly complex. Whether that means increasing resolution, adding more physical processes, so not just atmosphere and ocean and ice, but also more complex land models, vegetation models, biogeochemistry, atmospheric chemistry. We want to model all these aspects of the Earth system because they impact human and animal and plant life throughout the Earth and also the climate. The challenge is that we've been able to do a lot of these advances in terms of adding more and more components because you wait long enough, the computers get faster, and thus you can increase your resolution or add other complexities needed. However, this trend has been slowing down as of late. While we're still able to cram more and more transistors onto a single onto our computing chips, we're doing this only by increasing the number of cores, so making our chips effectively bigger, and then trying to deal with issues of like power and communication. In the process, our single thread performance, this kind of blue line, is sort of trailing off over time, and this is on a logarithmic scale. So with that, if we can't count on the computers to get faster, maybe we should update our codes to make them more clever. However, that's also a big challenge because we have a lot of legacy software that is hard to manually optimize and interface in our system models. So decades of Fortran components, and then now trying to fit together all these different Fortran models that were developed by different communities means we kind of have a mess of code that's harder and harder and requires more and more person time to make work well and work better. So as a result, the business as usual in our system modeling is becoming infeasible, and there's a lot of interest in what are kind of the next steps, what are the next directions, and some of the next directions are guided by the kind of strengths and weaknesses of our Earth system scientist community. Our Earth scientists are generally good at designing rigorous modeling experiments, been generating lots of model output. Or things like CMIP continue to grow by leaps and bounds in terms of data generated every cycle. We're able, especially when you're running at high resolution, you just generate more data, and we want to keep around more variables. So there's no shortage of data to work with here. We're also, as our system scientists, we're really good at analyzing results for physical consistency, correctness, looking at all kinds of different phenomena and how they interact with each other. However, as Earth system scientists, we're generally not computer scientists or software engineers. We aren't trained to write, say, clean, accessible, highly optimized, high-performance software. And we also have, like, the software that is written tends to be written for more traditional setups like CPUs rather than writing explicitly for distributed parallel computing or specialized processors like GPUs and TPUs. But is there some way we can take advantage of basically our science being able to generate lots of data, and while we can write code, we're not necessarily going to write the best, fanciest code ever. This is where there's an opportunity for machine learning to come in. Machine learning models, you can build a mapping from one set of inputs to one set of outputs, given a ton of specialized data for that, whatever you're trying to do. And machine learning tends to work really well for optimizing processes that are hard to describe formally and or are expensive to perform otherwise. So things like labeling images or translating language, or kind of a lot of these processes are like can be done by humans, but it requires paying someone to do it, which is in some cases very beneficial, but in a lot of cases is very expensive and time consuming. And if you want to analyze lots of data, you're waiting years and years for people to go through that process. So with machine learning, if you could automate this successfully, we may be able to get orders of magnitude speed ups on the at various stages in the pipeline. One other advantage we have with machine learning approaches is that unlike, say, writing a new numerical model or parameterization, we can leverage a lot of machine learning modeling software development that's going on in other communities that have developed very accessible machine learning libraries that work across GPUs and TPUs and just about any other software package under the sun. We can use their work pretty easily and just bring in our data into it. So by taking advantage of software investments in other fields, we can lift ours up. A rising tide lifts all boats. So as a result, we've identified machine learning emulation as our in-car analytics and integrated machine learning group. We've identified machine learning emulation as a priority area to research in and examine kind of the feasibility of doing this. We're looking at it across multiple problems that span sort of the Earth system spectrum and across different in-car labs. So to basically see what are some representative problems, what can we do really well, or what are some existing challenges that we need to overcome in order to make this a kind of feasible thing that we can recommend everyone do. So the first approach we're going to talk about is machine learning the worm rain process. This is recently we have a paper which was accepted in James, led by Andrew Gettleman. Our other co-authors are listed above. The motivation for this work is that precipitation formation, so basically going from clouds to rain or snow, is a critical uncertainty source in weather and climate models. For this work, we're focusing on cloud to rain formation, so we're ignoring ice because that's a even more challenging problem. But what's essentially happening in the real atmosphere is that when you have a bunch of cloud droplets in the cloud, they eventually collide with each other under the right circumstances and form raindrops through a process called autoconversion. Once you have some raindrops, they can also collide with existing with other cloud droplets in the form of accretion, and raindrops can also collide with each other through a process called self-collection. This can be modeled explicitly with something called a bin microphysics scheme, where we take our distribution of rain and cloud droplet sizes and model it as kind of this sort of a bent histogram, which allows us a lot of flexibility and modeling things like bimodal distributions. But it also requires a lot of computation because we are explicitly simulating all the interactions among every bin. It's also fairly memory intensive for the same reason, because you have to do this at every single grid cell in the model. So in practice, most Earth system models and weather models use a bulk microphysics scheme where they assume a parametric particle size distribution. And this works pretty well, but because of the assumptions of these distributions, which tend to be kind of a gamma or exponential distribution, that limits the kinds of drop and droplet relationships that you can model. So the goal with this research is, can we use machine learning to emulate the properties of a bin scheme and insert it into a bulk scheme so that we can run a microphysics scheme that emulates the bin properties, but with the computational overhead of the bulk. So with this, we could run, like, estimate kind of the uncertainties associated with this, but run it out at like climate change timescales and see how that affects, say, the results of of one of our long-running simulations, and how sensitive are the like cloud feedbacks to like temperature changes and other, and increasing CO2 and other changes to the Earth system. So how do we set this up? First, we run our community atmosphere model version 6 for 2 years, and we generate a bunch of data fields that describe things like the cloud and rainwater properties, kind of in bulk terms. With this simulation, we run the bin scheme forward and basically use the we run the bin scheme to advance each cloud, the properties of the cloud and rainwater forward in time. Then we calculate the bulk statistics from the outputs of the bin scheme, do all the dynamics, go back to the bin scheme again and run it forward. So it's kind of a hybrid in a lot of ways. But once we have this data generated, we then will pre-process it by identifying the locations where there are clouds and rain occurring. We do some other normalizations and transforms to make the data ready for machine learning. And then we have a set of neural networks to act as our emulator system. Because this is a conditional process, there's not always cloud to rain transitions going on. We have a set of machine learning classifiers that predict if the tendencies of each term that we're predicting are non-zero. If they are, we have a second neural network that predicts the magnitude of the tendency, and otherwise the tendency is 0. We split the tendency out. We've done log transforms on all of them because the distributions are exponential, and if you just fit the machine learning model to the non-transform distributions, it tends not to do very well. So we have some conversions that have to be done to go in and out of from the original terms to the tendencies, but altogether this gets us a reasonable result. So first we have our offline evaluation, where we take the model run we trained on, split it into a kind of training period and an evaluation period, and calculate kind of our standard verification metrics. We find that we get very high accuracy at like 99% accuracy or so at determining when we have 0 or non-zero tendencies, and then for each tendency, we're also for the most part, we're able to predict really close to the one-to-one line on replicating the tendency values themselves. There is some spread for some of the tendencies, but this is kind of on the colors on a log scale, so there's only a very small number of outliers in the overall data set. We can also see from this bottom panel that if you compare the tau bin and the original bulk scheme, there's some pretty big differences in the tendencies that they predict when running alongside each other. So so the kind of belies the advantage of using a different scheme is that we will get a different result. So it is kind of worthwhile. We're not just trying to replicate something that's already in there. We can also see on this chart on the left that we are also closely replicating the distribution of the original bin scheme. So you can, the blue and purple, there's a blue line and that's the emulator, and the purple line is the bin scheme. There's some differences, but they pretty well overlap each other in most instances. There is a little bit of underdoing of the tails of the distribution, but for the most part, we're able to get quite close, and it's not a huge discrepancy there. Running it offline is only one step of the process. Like the real test of this is, can we take the emulator and put it back into the climate model and get good results? So to do this, we have basically run our, so we have our control run. We also have our that we kind of with the control run in this case is with the bin micro, or the bulk microphysics scheme. Then we have our bin run, and then we have our machine learning emulator run where we put it back in the climate model. To do this, we wrote a Fortran inference subroutine that allows you to basically take a trained neural network from TensorFlow, save it out into a form that can be read into something like CAM, and then run forward in time. And we've run a couple of different scenarios. So the one we're going to focus on is our comparing with the base climate with the 2000 climatology, and we've run it forward for 9 years successfully. We've also done some tests with pre-industrial and SST plus 4K forcing to see how robust it is in each of those situations. So one thing we found, and this is in the base climate, is that in order to run this completely successfully, we do need to also include what's called a mass fixer. There are a few percentage of the data points result, and when you predict the tendency and add it to the current values, you sometimes get like negative mixing ratios and stuff. So we do have to have some corrections for those kind of situations. But it's usually when the model is predicting very small amounts, so it doesn't have a huge impact on the solution. We do see that this does occur preferentially in certain locations on the planet, such as in the South Pacific is pretty noticeable, or South Pacific, South Atlantic, and also Indian Ocean, and seems to be along certain storm tracks. In terms of feedbacks in the system, for things like precipitation, we're able to closely emulate the original tau microphysics scheme in terms of its results. With no mass fixture, we do kind of over-predict the frequency of large-scale precipitation. With the mass fixture in place, we're much closer to emulating tau with some discrepancy for very large precipitation amounts. If you look at it in terms of as a function of latitude, we're also the emulators are very close to the actual tau machine learning scheme and very different from the control run. Nothing is particularly close to the actual CloudSat precipitation data, unfortunately, but we were at least able to get different results and somewhat closer results in the tropics. So there are some positive things to see here. We also look at some other cloud feedbacks and are able to confirm that the tau and the tau machine learning for these are also very close to each other. They're not exactly the same, but they're quite close. So that's a generally good result to see. We're looking at ways to further improve it and see if we can get an even closer fit. So far, this is kind of like the settings we picked seem to be fairly robust. The next project I want to talk about is machine learning emulation of the Gecko A chemistry model. So we're kind of switching from microphysics to chemistry, which may seem like a completely different world, but there's in some ways a lot of similarities. So the Gecko A model is the generator of explicit chemistry and kinetics of organics in the atmosphere. We're interested in modeling this because there's a lot of natural and anthropogenic sources that emit a large number of volatile organic compounds. When these are released into the atmosphere, photochemical oxidation leads to hundreds of thousands of volatile products that condense to form organic aerosols. So we go from, called precursor chemicals like toluene or methane or isoprene, and they undergo chemical reactions when the sun shines on them and interact with other atmospheric components and create a whole bunch of gases and aerosols. Some of those they can have various impacts on things like the climate, on human health, et cetera. So we can explicitly simulate this with Gecko A. It has all the chemical reaction processes coded up in it, and this is fairly complicated because the oxidation of some of these compounds involve nearly 400,000 compounds and over 2 million reactions. So with that level of complication, this is typically run as we call a box model. So we kind of fix the conditions in a certain location and we can integrate it forward in time. But ideally, we want to run this like in a weather or climate model. So we run it at every location and kind of advect things around and then simulate the chemical reactions and how they evolve in space and time. The problem is that Gecko A itself is too computationally intensive to run in that mode by itself. So maybe if we can emulate it successfully with a machine learning model, then we can run the machine learning model within something like WRF-Chem or GeoSChem or another big 3D chemistry model, and approximate what result we get with Gecko, but run it in fast enough time that we could use it as like for actual like atmospheric chemistry weather prediction, for instance. So the way we set this up is we've generated three different precursor species. We've generated a set of Gecko runs for each of them, just using kind of a Latin hypercube sampling across various initial conditions of the runs. Within these runs, the main thing we were tracking is the mass of the chemical precursor and then the concentrations of the gas and aerosol phases. And we kind of treat them as bins, kind of like in the bin microphysics scheme, so we can represent the distributions of their concentrations in terms of something called volatility. We also have different environmental features like temperature, solar zenith angle, pre-existing aerosols, ozone, NOx, and hydroxide as further inputs because they all have effects on how the modeling goes. And so we've run for each of these. We have like 2,000 experiments. We run for 1440 time steps, output every 5 minutes. So it's like a 5-day run with the conditions fixed for each run, but then we vary the conditions across runs. So the machine learning model should learn to interpolate these fixed conditions and come up with some kind of smooth trajectory, hopefully. For our initial benchmarking, the first challenge is just to take is basically to kind of emulate the initial fixed box mode that we're running on. So we give it all of these different inputs. We send our data through a single layer 500 neuron dense neural network that basically, given the current time step, predicts the precursor aerosol and gas phases, the bins for the next time step, and then just repeat the process. We run it forward in time and compare the machine learning emulated trajectories with the original model trajectories. To do this for good statistical reasons, we have a training set of runs and then a separate validation set of runs that we keep separate. Because we are obviously not emulating all of the 400,000 chemical reactions, we run an ensemble of neural networks. So we train them with just randomize the initial conditions, then run them forward in time, and that gives us an ensemble of outputs that we can use to see how, like, what the spread in the solutions are and how good it performs. So these are on the left are a select set of experiments we run with it, just kind of randomly chosen. The up top column or top row is the precursor. And all these experiments basically exponentially decreases over time, but depending on the experiment, it decreases at different rates. So here's one experiment where it goes down really fast. Another experiment goes down more slowly. usually the precursor gets first converted into gas, so you initially see a spike. As the precursor goes away, you see the gas spike and then decrease. At the same time, we have the aerosol starts increasing. So yes, we have a pretty good modeling of the precursor decrease with some uncertainty as it kind of bottoms out. Gas we capture quite well across these experiments, and then with aerosol we capture the general trend, although we sometimes are struggling with getting the ensemble to completely cover the true trajectory. You also notice there are these like kind of sort of wavy lines in the gas and the precursor. These are because the temperature is varied slightly on a diurnal cycle during the course of the run. So the machine learning model can kind of capture that, but not as well as we were hoping. One of the challenges we have with this is that when we're running this forward in time, maintaining numerical stability can be challenging. We've had to do a lot of hyperparameter tuning by adding some regularization. Turns out adding lots of neurons at the single layer seems to work fairly well and give us the most robust results, at least on this problem. And we have some statistics down here showing our relative performance across the different fields. So we're at least with this, some of the experiment, we've gotten some configurations that seem to perform pretty well. We're also doing more automated hyperparameter tuning to basically see if we can get further improvements in performance and further results there. We also have some kind of bulk results here. A lot of the highest error occurs kind of in the initial part of the run, and then over time things kind of flatten out, and kind of see the sort of this is the mean absolute error, and then this is kind of the error bounds with respect to the like average run from Gecko. So the errors for like precursor are relatively small, a bit larger for aerosol and a bit less for gas. And then our ensembles are also fairly reliable. Again, they have the most spread kind of early on in the run, and then it decreases as the run goes on once things stabilize. We also have been keeping track of when in the run we get some instabilities. We see them pop up primarily with the precursor and fairly early. There's just certain situations where in the parameter space where the precursor seems to do worse. So we're continuing to investigate some of these instabilities, but also trying to move forward and working on incorporating this into the geoskim models is our target to do more 3D modeling. We're also interested in trying different chemical species and emulating other chemical processes, since we're seeing some success with this. So then we're going to turn to our next, our third project we're going to talk about today, which is the Holodeck. The Holodeck is a cloud particle imager, so kind of tying back to microphysics. So with the microphysics project, we were emulating cloud to rain processes. With Holodeck, we want to actually observe the raindrops and cloud droplets themselves and learn about their properties in the atmosphere. So with this, the instrument is the holographic detector for clouds. It's called that because it's a probe you put on an aircraft. It shoots a laser at a camera. The laser light diffracts off of the cloud particles and creates this diffraction pattern in the camera. You can then take these diffraction patterns and if you invert them with an analytical process, you can then recover the exact location in this 3D volume, location and size of any droplets that were observed. The challenge with this is that this process of inverting these holograms is very computationally intensive. It takes like a week on, let's see. So the images are one very large. So like a full image may contain about over 1,000 particles. We have to get these individual particles, we have to refocus the image 1,000 times at different kind of depths to find the particles themselves. and one for like processing data for one flight of the instrument can take up to 2 million core hours per project. So this is like running the Cheyenne supercomputer for a week, just doing this, which means that we're like, you have to fly the plane and hope you get good results once you get back on the ground. If you could speed up this processing, there's a lot of potential for either doing a lot more flights, or if you could get it closer to real time, maybe you can try to steer the plane toward better parts of the cloud to sample certain different ice particles or raindrops, and then maybe you can get more data or better data for a given amount of flight time. So there's a lot of cost savings that could also lead to potentially better science by successful machine learning emulation in this case. So we're starting with synthetic data because the real holograms are still quite big. The first step in this is when we're dealing with multiple holograms, one of the hard parts is actually localizing where the particles are given the holographic image. So what we're doing is first coarsely trying to predict what locations in a given hologram actually have a particle in it. And so to do this, one technique we're looking at is borrowing from the kind of natural language processing. So we're basically using a sequential model to first predict where the largest particle is in the image, and then the second largest, and the third largest, and so on. And it kind of looks like sort of generating a sentence from pictures. So we like predict start, and then where the first particle should be, so 23. So we say this particle, then this particle, then this particle, and then stop. The advantage of this approach is that we can kind of then sparsely, like because there's a varying number of particles in the image, we can like search over the image in a way that it can account for varying numbers of particles, and is a little bit more of a sparse search. To get the space to search over, we first train something called a variational autoencoder. So we take our hologram and then we train two neural networks, an encoder network and a decoder network, to learn a low-dimensional latent space, latent vector that encodes the important properties of the hologram, which we can then use to reconstruct the hologram. So you look at these two images. The one on the left, we basically has like two big spots and then lots of concentric rings. By using the VAE, we're able to save out where the main concentric rings are, but kind of filter out sort of the other areas of interference that are less important. Thus, we've learned something about encoding the main particles in the image. From this, we can then train just like a regular recurrent neural network to predict the XY location of the particles, and more specifically, as well as the depth and diameter of the particles. To train this to run really well, we used a hyperparameter optimization system called Optuna. We've added some other features on top of it that allows us to kind of do distributed hyperparameter optimization. So we have a supercomputer, let's use it. From this, we then let it run forward in time, sample different potential hyperparameters, run them, validate them, and then use the results of the validation to pick the next set of hyperparameters. So this is a kind of Bayesian optimization. We first do the first 100 trials, we randomly sample hyperparameters to get a good sampling of the latent space, and then after that, we use the Bayesian optimization to pick the best ones after from there. This optimization used 500 GPU core hours and 5,000 CPU core hours, so we can easily scale, and we're also able to see some pretty good improvements over time. So it basically gives us confirmation that we are in fact improving our predictions with this approach. To give you some examples of good and bad performance with this model, here's a hologram with 3 particles in it. The true hologram is on the left, the predicted is on the right. We're able to see that in this case, we get everything quite fairly close. We get the locations of the particles correct, and the sizes and depths of them are also pretty close on. And in this case. The diameters are the particularly important thing to get close on, because we want to estimate our particle size distributions in our clouds, which we can then use to validate our models. This is another image that we did particularly well on. One thing also to note is the background is kind of the reconstruction of the hologram by the VAE, so you can kind of see what like our input looks like versus our output. You can see that we're able to do a fairly good reconstruction. And as another case where, as long as the particles are fairly far apart from each other, it does quite well. Where it gets a little bit trickier is when we have like particles that are overlapping with each other. So in this case, we get one particle that's off on the side fairly well, and the large particle that's kind of on the right-hand side, we also get really closely, but we are running into the problem with the neural network not being able to disentangle these two particles that are nearly overlapping. It actually gets the diameter of this one pretty, the second particle pretty close, but the location is off, and the z value is off. So that is a challenge here. There's another case where there's a small particle close to a bigger particle, and we aren't able to, it just didn't predict that there was a particle here. So this is another a challenge we're having to deal with. Some things that may improve this, we expect, are using a finer grid in terms of the initial localization. This comes with additional computational costs because there's more tokens you have to predict. We're also looking at other approaches that are fully convolutional, like the UNet, where we can go from basically an image to another image. And so given a holographic image, predict each pixel whether there's a particle there. We can do this probabilistically, and there are kind of initial experiments. We've found that the highest probability predictions tend to be where actual particles are. There are some false alarms where it picks up on interactions with like rings, but this is another area where we think further optimization should get us increasingly better results. This is still fairly new, and there's a lot of further optimization to be done. We see this as we're also looking at ways to scale this up. So looking at chopping the image into smaller pieces and kind of fitting on only the smaller pieces should allow us to scale up to the full-size holograms and eventually get to our goal of handling lots of particles and running this closer to real time. Along the way, though, we're still also looking at the kind of infrastructure cost of machine learning emulation. We have the potential to save a lot of computing time by training machine learning emulators that are faster than whatever process they're emulating. But the emulation itself requires a lot of infrastructure, kind of like a nuclear plant. A nuclear plant, you have a little bit of radioactive material that can produce a very large amount of power if you set up the situation correctly. But it does require a lot of shielding and other infrastructure to mine the radioactive material and process it and deal with the waste. So what does that look like in terms of machine learning emulation? Some of the infrastructure will, if we want to put machine learning emulators throughout the Earth system and our models and observation systems, we'll need to think about what are efficient ways to do data generation. Can we build more robust machine learning to Fortran interfaces so that it's easy to integrate the trained machine learning models into like a CESM or WRF or whatever other modeling system is out there. In the process, we also want to have organization and standards for storing our machine learning model collections, because if you have lots of emulators and lots of machine learning models, you need to have a naming convention for them. You need to have some kind of place in the model folder to keep track of all the emulators so that it's not a jumble of neural network weights. You also may need specialized hardware like GPUs or other AI advanced chips that are coming on the market. And we need to really effectively benchmark just how much of a speed up is this chip giving us, because the hardware itself can give you a like speed up the computation part of the process, but if you have to move a bunch of data in and out of the chip and everything else is running on CPU, then you may have a big slowdown waiting for data to move on and off the chip. So good benchmarking is really important to make sure we're actually getting the proper speed up and not just looking at the one, like basically one part of the system and ignoring all the other costs. For some of these emulators, you may run into issues where they need physical constraints and other fail-safes to make sure they don't blow up the model, kind of melt down in this case. Those also incur additional computational costs and maintenance costs to build those into the code. I also want to monitor our code to make sure it's not having any meltdowns or other issues causing potential problems like energy conservation or climate drift. There have been some examples where like the model stopped raining after a certain amount of time with a neural network emulator. So how do we prevent these kinds of problems? There's also just the ongoing issues of code and data maintenance and retraining. Like eventually you want to retrain your emulator and then put that into the model. How's that affect things? You may need to regenerate all of your the data to train the emulator. So that's another cost that you have to factor in. Currently, you don't have good numbers for all of these things, but I think it's really important as a community to start looking at these kinds of costs as we really move toward embracing emulators as seems to be happening right now. So the big question is emulation going to be worth the effort? I hope it is, but as a scientific community, we need to get good numbers and find out. So with that, in summary, machine learning emulation is potentially a viable path forward to incorporating complex Earth system process models into Earth system models without blowing the computation budget. We've seen some promising results in 3 areas: microphysics, atmospheric chemistry, and cloud particle emulation. And we're continuing to work across NCAR labs to integrate into more modeling systems and estimate our true infrastructure costs. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for listening.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. So it looks like we have plenty of time for questions. Oh, I see. This one from Dakota. There was a raised hand for a moment. Yeah, I have a few questions. So you use emulation in a pretty wide way to emulate physical processes, and you mentioned data. So are you emulating also like? Are you also thinking of simulations that are high fidelity that you're approximating, or both? Or is it just data? It doesn't matter where it comes from.
Yeah, it's we have like for the projects we're showing, they're more like simulated data focused, but we're also looking at have another project on machine learning parameterization of the surface layer, where we're training the machine learning models from observations and putting that into our numerical models. One of the challenges with that is data consistency issues. So with surface layer flux observations, there's not a lot of sites that actually measure the flux directly. A lot of them use a approximation that we're trying to get around to calculate the flux values. So that is a challenge, is getting good observations for things we want to emulate if you want to use observations. There's definitely other groups doing like emulating really high fidelity simulations, whether they be like super parameterizations or large eddy simulations, or kind of other things that are really computationally intensive, sort of following this kind of model.
Yeah, you have a few. I can follow up on that, but I see several other questions.
Can I quickly follow up, because I have a kind of a question that's very closely related. So you mentioned the term parametrization, and then you've been talking a lot about emulation. So I was wondering, like, are these the same thing, or are these not the same thing? Like I've heard a lot about kind of this parametrization of climate models. It sounds to me very similar to what you described, but are these somehow different, or is it the same?
There's some key differences. So I guess in the Earth's like weather and climate modeling community, parameterization usually refers to like approximate models of physical processes that are not resolved on the grid scale that the model is being run on. So this common parameterizations are like the big ones are radiation, convection, microphysics, which is anything with clouds. So like how the cloud droplets and raindrops and ice crystals, so, sort of transition between different phases, and how much heat and cooling they generate. There's also parameterizations that act as kind of couplers between different parts of the system. So like the surface layer parameterization is a coupling between the atmosphere and the land surface. So like there's separate land surface models that like simulate the soil conditions and like how the type of plant or land cover affects the atmosphere. Some of these parameterizations are already emulations of other more complex versions of them. So like the microphysics scheme and that's currently in CAM, the MG2 scheme is actually an emulation of another like a large eddy simulation, more explicit microphysics scheme. With that emulation, they're just essentially using it kind of a more or less a linear regression type kind of fit to that, so a much simpler emulator than what we're using. But usually with when I'm saying emulation, it's using some kind of statistical or machine learning model to approximate some kind of other complex model, whether it be a parameterization or something like this observation processing procedure.
So I have a cool question, and that's a problem we have with emulations. Sometimes you want to emulate really costly simulations, and they're very constrained. Like for one parameter, you have a batch or ensemble. Or I'm just like, how many simulations do you need, and do they need to be kind of spread out in a certain way? I mean, you mentioned the Latin hypercube, and like, what's the order of simulations you need to train? It might depend on.
Yeah, it seems like it's very problem dependent. I don't have a good number. With the we did some sensitivity testing on like on the Gecko simulation, and we found that to get good performance, we needed at least 1,000 experiments to start getting good performance, and then like the improvements slowed down between 1,000 and 2,000, but we were still seeing improvements. So one of the hard things to run into with I guess with the emulation process is figuring out how good is good enough, because even in a lot of cases the domain scientists may not know, because this is kind of a new thing in a lot of ways. Like in an ideal world, they want like kind of numerical precision replication of the models, but we're not able to provide that. But at the same time, we're still able to get fairly close results that aren't like going to that should result in like same precipitation distributions and other outcomes. With like it won't be exactly the same, but the statistics will be right, and if that's satisfactory, then that's good enough. But it's one of those things that still requires, I think, a lot more discussion and collaboration with our sort of domain scientist partners, and we're working on that. But it's a it's a fair bit of work to continue like build up these kind of relationships and have the necessary discussions.
Yeah, I'm super interested in. Just see that the tons of questions here. So Aram Hamidi have questions. Should I read it or?
I could read it.
The question is the accuracy of localization part in the order of micromillimeter. And then another question, yeah.
Can you clarify which problem is this for the holodeck, I'm assuming?
Aram, do you want to take the question directly? It showed up a little bit late. And there's a follow-up. Do you think using semantic segmentation would help with the problem of detecting collided particles?
I think I'm connected to audio, so I think we need to just read out the questions. I would imagine that the first question probably is for the holodeck. I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I think that's the project he's referring to.
Yeah, the accuracy of the localization is micromillimeter. It's I think or don't remember the exact units, but yeah, we're talking very, very small kind of distances. From a machine learning perspective, though, it is trying to separate these like we're trying to, I guess, identify locations in a 3D volume, but with only given a 2D image. We do have the like exact locations at least to break this out. And with the UNet, we're trying to use essentially a semantic segmentation, but we're still trying to optimize it further to deal with things like collided particles. There's also issues with like the signal, the kind of diffraction patterns from large, like particles that are large and close to the image will kind of overwhelm the signals from the ones that are much weaker. So this is a problem we're still dealing with. It's also an issue with like neural networks in general. They have a tendency to focus in on the strong signals, and sometimes will filter out the weaker signals. So this could be a potential deal breaker with Holodeck, but we're trying different techniques to move forward on it. So we also with Holodeck and with these 3 data sets, we're also interested. We've released initial versions of these data sets publicly through our. If you go to AI4ESS.org, or sorry, I need to send that to everyone.
Yeah, I see a question about public available data for these ML models.
Yeah, so
Right.
we've released initial versions of these data sets through we had a AI for System Science Summer School last summer, and created some notebooks and data sets to practice on. So if you're interested, you can go and explore some of these data sets already. We're working on kind of an updated release of all the data sets and new notebooks and more kind of explanations and tutorials, aiming for kind of the late summer, early fall timeframe. So we're doing our own experiments to try to see what we can get to work, but we know there's a much larger community out there, people who could try a whole suite of different machine learning methods, and the hope is to also spur people to research on these problems, because they are quite challenging in their own ways, and see if we can either make progress here or help spur like trying different machine learning techniques and advances on the machine learning side too.
And Hamish, Gordon has a question. Did you need a mass fixer for each important compound represented by Gecko, as you did for the microphysics emulator?
So far, we haven't needed the mass fixer for Gecko. I think there are some cases where occasionally I've seen the neural network go negative with its estimates of volatility, which isn't ideal. But the runs, like for the most part, generally everything stays positive, and just by doing things like log transforms on the precursor, that seems to help keep things running reasonably well.
Thanks. That's a very nice talk, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Hamish. So another question popped up. After training your emulator, is there a way to give guarantees that the emulator will not explode when applied in slightly different configurations? Like a weather forecast emulator trained on a historical period, but applied in a warmer climate.
That is a good question. I think we're. I don't think we have the way to do that just yet. I know people are working on various kinds of physics guided or physics informed or other, trying to add other invariances to the machine learning training problem. If you look up Tom Buechler's work, he has some papers that were looking at things like using relative humidity instead of like mixing ratio, that gives you some more climate invariance. So far, there doesn't seem to be I would say that something that's completely data independent. There's also people working on different ways to train models that are more invariant to distribution shifts, or doing things like data augmentation. But yeah, so far this is still an open problem, not just with emulators, but a lot of machine learning stuff in general.
Daniel Howard, do you want to take the question or directly?
Sure. I was just going to ask, in terms of emulation replacing some of the more computational expensive parts of VSMs, where do you see that pressing difficulty in that kind of proposed transition? Is it with like the software engineering side, like implementing hardware, getting access to hardware, navigating something like the newer GPU TPU spaces and HPC systems, or something else that comes to mind that makes this kind of newer process of performing weather forecasting research be made difficult come to mind?
Yeah, a lot of the issues we run into are kind of, let's say, infrastructure related. We have the computing resources, but like a lot of the time can be taken up with just like writing the sort of Fortran machine learning interfaces, making sure they work well. Like if you want to add a new variable, you have to go in and like update the source code, retrain all the models. It's still fairly labor intensive. We also currently are like working across labs, so we like on the machine learning group side, we train a new emulator and then we give it off to the our climate scientist colleagues, and then they go and run the model. And it can be like weeks before we get the full feedback to say, oh, ran it, didn't work, back to go retrain. So if we can find ways to speed up this kind of feedback cycle. By just having like better, more accessible software, just kind of addressing some of these bottlenecks, we should be able to make more progress over time. That's why we spend a lot of effort on the hyperparameter tuning, automating that process, because that was also a very time-consuming thing just on the machine learning side. So we've made some good progress on getting that working across different problems. There's still it's its own beast in a lot of ways, because it's sort of doing machine learning on top of the machine learning, and you have to, and there's always it's like another level of hyperparameters you have to set in the hyperparameter tuner to tune the original model. So it's not a complete solution to everything, but it seems to be getting us better, faster results and things that can account for feedbacks among different hyperparameters more effectively than the more traditional approach of grad student descent or other kind of just sort of varying one thing and then varying another thing.